Hey, this video is part of the EU Horizon 2020 funded UniSAFE project. UniSAFE produces knowledge, recommendations, and tools to address gender-based violence in university and research performing organizations. The topic of this recording is gender-based violence, focusing on key concepts, definitions, and issues, and is intended for students, researchers, and teachers. My name is Nicole Ovesen, and I've been part of the UniSAFE project as a postdoctoral researcher. I'll start by showing what the prevalence and consequences of gender-based violence can look like. The World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 3 women worldwide has been subjected to either physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence during their lifetime. 2 in 3 of the respondents to the UniSAFE survey on gender-based violence in academia had experience of gender-based violence at their workplace or where they studied. An EU-wide survey showed that between 45 and 55% of women had experienced sexual harassment since the age of 15. A recent American study shows that transgender people are 4 times more likely to be victims of violent crimes than cisgender people. And by cisgender, I mean people who identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. These are just 4 examples of the consequences and prevalence of gender-based violence. There are different understandings of both gender and gender-based violence in different national and organizational contexts. A common understanding and framing of gender-based violence focus almost entirely on violence against women in order to highlight the violence that many women and girls experience daily. For instance, harassment and abuse at the workplace, in educational settings, at home, or in the public space. Feminist activists and scholars have long been focusing on violence against women to emphasize that these types of violence specifically target women and girls because we live in gender unequal societies. Increasingly, we're starting to see a wider definition of gender-based violence, which includes all those who experience violence based on their gender and because of intersecting power and systemic inequalities. In UniSAFE, we consider gender-based violence to describe all forms of violence, violations, and abuse that are based on gender and go beyond narrow legal definitions, because it's not all types of gender-based violence which will, for instance, be defined as a crime within the criminal justice system. We conceptualize gender-based violence as part of a wider system of dominance and power inequalities that goes beyond a binary understanding of gender. This wide definition of gender-based violence relates to our understanding of gender as a social construct. This means that we understand gender as a hierarchy, a relation, and as a process, rather than as a biological fixed category. The definition of gender goes beyond a binary understanding of gender and makes it possible to include the experience of cisgender, transgender women and men, as well as gender non-conforming individuals. It's also important to look at how gender intersects with other systems of oppressions. This means, for instance, to look at how sexism, racism, and transphobia shape gender-based violence, for instance, towards transgender women of color, which creates specific barriers for help seeking and support. Gender-based violence includes all forms of violence in different spheres in our society, both online and offline. And the different forms of violence are often interconnected and work to uphold and reinforce each other. Sexual violence can, for instance, be reinforced by psychological and physical violence in terms of threat. Not all types of violence are easily recognized as violence. Violence is essentially about power and power abuse, and power abuse will often take a more subtle form, and it can be part of a repeated and ongoing process that can be either formally or informally institutionalized in organizations. It can include threats, coercion, and deprivation, and it will often have long-lasting effects. Finally, to sum up, gender-based violence describes and includes a continuum of violence, violations, and violence behavior and attitudes on the basis of gender, and it always intersects with other dimensions of inequality. And these different forms of violence help to reinforce each other. Gender-based violence occurs on different societal levels in interpersonal relationships. We have intimate partner violence or domestic violence, for instance. On an organizational level, we have sexual harassment at the workplace or in the educational setting. And on a structural level, we see it in legislation, for instance, removing reproductive rights, or legislation targeting particularly minority and marginalized groups. Overall, you can say that gender-based violence is an expression of power and dominance that reflects power relations in society as a whole. Thank you so much for listening.